Good evening and welcome. I'm Jesse Abbott. I teach philosophy and English here at Tunxis. And we have a lecture series that some of you are familiar with. This is the 2011-2012 installment of Proof and Possibility. We have kind of an ongoing tradition of support here at Tunxis that I want to give thanks to. Give thanks for. Dr. Catherine Addy, our president, is in the back here. Who's been an undying supporter of this series since its inception. Been very grateful for everything she's done to support the series. And Dr. Michael Rook, who's not, I believe, here today, is our academic dean. He's also extended a great deal of goodwill and support for the series. Carol Mahmood is chairperson of our humanities department, who's been behind Proof and Possibility since its beginning as well. I wanted to thank Mike Zish, who's doing our podcasting and recording for tonight. And also thank the Corner Cafe for feeding us so nicely tonight as well. This event is entitled Spirituality, Theology, or Philosophy. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about Rabbi Howard Herman. He was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, was ordained and received his doctorate from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in 1978 at their New York campus. Before he was ordained as a rabbi, he studied at both Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Jerusalem. In 1980, Rabbi Herman accepted the position of rabbi of the Farmington Valley Jewish Congregation's Emek Shalom. He also serves as the Jewish chaplain of the USVA medical centers in Newington and West Haven, Connecticut. He's been a longtime professor of philosophy here at Tunxis and elsewhere in the Connecticut Community College system. He hosts a show entitled Reflections on WTIC AM 1080 every Sunday morning, so you can check that out. It's a great show. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Howard Herman.
Thank you. I'm overwhelmed. Can you all hear me? Okay. I'm overwhelmed at the number of people who came out to hear this talk tonight. I'm not sure whether you're here for the talk or whether you're here for the food or if you're here from the camaraderie or if you're just here to see who your professor is if you're an online student, just to meet him for the very first time. Coming to Connecticut, actually coming back to Connecticut, was an interesting trip for me. You heard I grew up in Bridgeport in southern Connecticut, and when I came up to Simsbury to become the rabbi of the Farmington Valley Jewish Congregation, I thought that I had found a place, a home, and it was great. And then I got a call one day to ask if I was interested in teaching at Tunxis Community College. And whereas I hadn't really thought that much about teaching, I came for an interview, and I didn't teach philosophy at first. I taught a course in Judaism, and it was funded from the outside, and I was here for about 4 or 5 years. And it was at that point that I began teaching philosophy. And at that time, there was really no other philosophy person here. Now Jesse's here as a full-time professor, and it's great to see that philosophy has made such a presence here on this campus. And also, I teach at Capital Community College, and it's made a very big presence there as well. When Jesse called me and asked me if I would speak, and if I would come up with something that dealt with the philosophy of religion, I thought immediately of doing this possibly in Hebrew. That way, we make it a little bit non-understandable for you. And then I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't do it in Hebrew, maybe I should do it in Yiddish. But I quickly lost that thought as well. But I will tell you that throughout the entire preparation of this talk, I would think of a phrase that my mother used to say to me. And the phrase is in Yiddish, and if you know Yiddish, you'll understand the phrase. If not, I'll translate it for you. She used to say to me, "Howard, you can't tanza balachasanis." What that means is you can't dance at two weddings at the same time. And when you're trying to keep one foot in the world of philosophy and one foot in the world of religion, it's very difficult to straddle that line, that you don't veer left or right from time to time. So at the outset of my talk this evening, let me apologize, because there are going to be times that I veer left, and there are going to be times that I veer right. But hopefully it will enable you to understand a little bit about the tension that exists between the rational world of philosophy and what you might think of as the irrational world of spirituality. When Jesse asked me to speak, he asked me to prepare a little blurb. And one of the things that I wrote in this blurb was that denizens of two different worlds have never been happy creatures. Climbing half out of their own skin in an attempt to wholly enter one world or another world has always seemed to them to be somewhat artificial. The attempt at a personal wholeness based on some sort of acceptance of something, on the one hand, and on the other hand, of their dual state, or even the glorification of that state, often strikes them as being insufficiently real. So it's probably with the demons of an author like Isaac Bashevis Singer, human in the netherworld and demonic in the human world, at home in neither, and there's no place to rest. Such a creature, insofar as he seeks out the life of the spirit, is man. Half from the upper realm and half from the lower. Not quite at home, I might add, in heaven or in earth. The spiritual history of humanity can be read as nothing but a series of attempts at a resolution of some kind of internalized conflict between worlds about lifestyles above as well as below. Reconciliation of heaven and earth. The point where mystical union is personal integration. And yet, we as people, we try to opt for one world or the other. Alas, our attempt both to become angel and to deny the angelic in himself may have occasioned the great bales of what I like to think of as cosmic laughter and an infinite flow of heavenly tears. But they've left us no less fragmented than before. Once there was a moment of conversion, of knowing in the most intimate sense that above and below were silly attempts at distinction. that God flows into man and man into God so fully that to try to pull them apart can do nothing but violence to both of them. No, not a moment of conversion, but many such moments perhaps, and none of them quite conversionary. That indeed is the problem, and the question with which I begin. Is conversion in some way any longer possible for those who have so nearly been converted so often, and in whom there thus remains so little innocence? If you go to the Bible, there's a section of the Bible that says, "Open for me the gates of righteousness." Comes from the psalmist, from the book of Psalms. I come through them and praise the Lord. Standing at the gate, looking through to the other side, peering into wonderland, waiting. Open the gates for me. Open them yourself. Push. What are you hollering to me for? God says to Moses. You think I open gates for anyone? Tell the children of Israel to get moving. And sometimes it happens that a man's turning begins not on his own account. Rather, that individual is awakened to turning by some awesome presence which God in his bounty brings to that individual. Now this awe comes from above, and therefore it can't last forever. If it were indeed to last, that man's service would be only of that which comes from God himself. Thus, he takes away the awe which he's granted him, so that man will go to build up his own love of God. Then his service will truly be his own. This doesn't come to humanity so easily. It's a matter of great strength and concentration over long periods of time. When a person seeks love in this way and doesn't find it, he may cry out to God to help him as he had before. Such a prayer is really not answered. A person, it seems to me, has to work it out on their own. Thus far, a voice from the 18th century. That which you don't work out on your own in a struggle that has to begin way down here in the world of the ordinary weekday, these concessions somehow just seem not to be able to last. It doesn't mean that the first moment was any less real, but it does let you know that it can't become the replacement for the down here religious struggle. Struggle. Storm the gates. No, you don't have to. A gentle push might do just as well. So why don't we open them ourselves? if the gates to heaven are there before us, and we're standing so close, we can even see how they open, and we've even looked right through them, try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side. We stand almost dumbstruck, both before the gates as well as before the question. We remain afraid. Go back to the Old Testament. At Mount Sinai, the people said to Moses, "You go and talk. You talk to that thing. You go, man. You tell us what it says. We're not getting any closer to that smoking mountain." When I ask myself these days who we are, I hear myself answering, we are those who fled from Sinai. Now, that's sort of a bit of shorthand, a one-part reduction of a two-part statement. We are those who were there at Sinai and who fled. One who has not been there has no need to flee. They may be involved in some other flight to flatter themselves by thinking that it is Sinai they flee, but their confusion can be seen and their error palpably felt. Still, the myth of the faith community retains its meaning, no matter what Judeo-Christian community you hail from. We generally choose to see ourselves as those to whom God spoke, as those who listened, as those who agreed. Perhaps maybe a better word might be acquiesced rather than agreed. But that shouldn't be all. We're also those who fled. It doesn't make us the accused of God in any very particularistic sense. It simply makes us human. We're stating firmly that at Sinai we were more terrified mortals might give us a more complete and even realistic spiritual self-image. One of less angelic perfectionism, but one with which we might more readily identify. We are those who stood at Sinai, who saw, who heard, and we were scared out of our little minds, and we fled. This, you see, is one reason why we humans, I think, eternally wrestle with the divine. Faith is not one that hopes to reside in bliss, but rather one committed to movement and to struggle. Committed and destined. I'd want to say both. Committed to struggle because the ascent to the endless is itself endless. And we're constantly to see ourselves as climbing up Jacob's ladder, not satisfied ever to just stand on any one rung, and destined to struggle because we're always falling off and starting the ascent again and again and again. falling off the ladder because we refuse to ascend. Each rung is only strong enough to hold you for an instant. And because of our constantly silly habit of looking down and contemplating flight, we in that life, in the presence, will always be a struggle. It will always be a struggle for us. The discovery of God comes to us as a constant surprise. Sometimes to some almost a shock. For countless generations, we chant, "The whole earth is full of His glory." And yet each time we turn around and see the glory of God in a new place, we shudder with a mixture of fear and delight, astonishment, and sometimes awe. Our sense of wonder is always getting lost. The shallow rationalist bias creeps back in. It sits tight and waits to be blasted sky high before it will budge even an inch. Something in us is constantly repeating the primal conflict of Moses. Come on, stop wasting your time. The overeducated boy in him must have been saying, a plain, ordinary thorn bush and a little desert heat? Optical illusion. But Moses is, after all, Moses. And there has to be a story. He turned aside to look. He stopped. And there was God. He looked for a minute, saw and heard. And then, like one who still half thought he wasn't able to stand it, perhaps feared it, that he wouldn't be able to stand it, what does he do? He hides his face. I don't know how many of you know the Hebrew word tzaddik. And I don't know whether you know what a tzaddik is. You want to know what a tzaddik is? Rabbi Chaim Heikel of Amdur says, we ordinary men need the hiding. We need to have God hide His light from us. The tzaddik says no. No to hiding. He stares directly into the sun. Moses, even Moses, hid his face and said, why don't you send someone else? Brinksmanship, unspeakable risk, borderline madness of intensity, blindness of immersion. Those are the things it takes to be a tzaddik. Most of us prefer just to be plain humans, ever living in the stream of our particular dialectical movement, confronting and hiding, moments of presence, followed in rapid succession by moments of dryness and despair. In other generations, this cyclical motion was interpreted differently. But our particular version of it seems to run something like this. disbelief, seduction, wonder, living in the presence, terror, flight, disbelief, and so on and so forth. Each movement in the cycle is tyrannical and dogmatic. Disbelief has no faith in the rebirth of wonder. And in our moments of living in the presence, we're revolted by the cynicism and the self-conscious secularism of our unbelieving periods. The 21st century individual, the 21st century person, lives as though bound to the cycle of wonder and doubt. Wonder and doubt. Wonder and doubt. We don't seek liberation by means of breaking out of the cycle, opting for either world, as I've said, can lead only to the prolonging of fragmentation. We see spiritual, what I like to call ebb and flow. Moments of absence and moments of presence, as central to the human religious situation. Our desire is to neither deny nor escape it, but rather to learn to be a religious, or if you don't like the word religious, spiritual human being in our moments of spiritual ebb. What else can be done with a moment of disbelief in our cycle? If we're not to deny the cycle altogether, we must allow ourselves to ever be torn apart by the shallow cynicism that we should like to have transcended long ago. Can there be spiritual growth if there has to be constant return to such a coarse moment of ebb? Most basically, in viewing the ebb and flow of the Spirit's presence within us, can we step beyond conflict and see the thing as rhythm, as rhythmic movement that brings some excitement to spiritual life, and inspiration to the downs as well as to the ups? Theological texts, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with theological texts, but theological texts which comprise some of the literature we have that is most attuned to the problems of spiritual quest know this problem well. And it goes across the board. If you look at Jewish sources, if you look at Christian sources, if you look at Muslim sources, it doesn't matter. They are all attuned to the issue of spiritual quest. And they know the problem quite well. It's called running back and forth. Man runs back and forth. Man runs in and out of the divine presence. And the presence itself seems to be running back and forth and in and out of the human soul. It seems to be largely the movement of the Spirit that creates the spiritual cycle. Ultimate conversion is not to be made easy for us. And at the same time, the spiritual master of these theological texts perhaps through the very running back and forth, which allowed them a theologicalization of the spiritual reality, were able to live with a cynical movement, and they continue to build. This, then, is what we seek to articulate: a contemporary theology of running back and forth. There was a time when the appropriate geographical metaphor for our spiritual lives seemed to be one of isolated, widely separated peaks set in the midst of broad, extended flatlands. The task we then set for ourselves was that the ascending of the mountain with some measure of safety, to bring down its secret, hoping thereby to give some light to the vast and empty world of the everyday. Then we were rather sure that we wanted to begin with the highs, that they were the paradigm of religious awareness after which the everyday was to be remodeled, or was to be reformulated, or was to be remolded. If you will permit a rather simplistic reading of religious tradition, a kind of Sabbath and weekday model, where one clearly knows which are the peaks and which are the valleys, the goal, the world that is holy Sabbath. But the humdrum world persists. The weekday simply doesn't want to be the Sabbath. To make the Sabbath the model for a re-spiritualized weekday is eschatological. In our schema, it would mean breaking out of the cycle, a radical spiritualism that would deny legitimacy to moments of the spiritual ebb that I spoke about earlier. We do not always live in the glow of a spiritual Sabbath. When we don't, we have to begin from below. There is no upper light that's flowing into us. We have only the world that we know. The discovery of the presence in the world below, in the vast earthiness of the weekday, this then becomes our task. Any time is a good time in seeking out one's religious way in the world. I don't mean by this an undiscriminating embrace of the secular, which has come to characterize the religious stance of many, many people. They have good reason to be in rebellion against an anti-worldly spiritualism. I mean rather a more profound fusion of the religious and the secular. One which can turn inward a real spiritual life, partly in order to nurture the outer life, and one which labors to love in the secular world without granting it ultimate full-time seriousness. Religious work in the weekday world, as I would see it today, has to proceed from that element within any pious tradition which sought to deny the separability of matter and spirit. We are not interested in redeeming the spark from any earthly prison. We need rather to discover that all is spark. Nor do we seek to rejoice in the transparency of illusion or material reality. We do not experience ourselves or one another as a body and soul, but we look at ourselves as body-soul. We seek our exaltation in the spirit that can be known in the very flesh of the material world, the breath of all life and the spirit of all flesh. This is the quality of running back and forth that I referred to earlier. This is the quality of running back and forth that we're after. That which is most faithful, both to our own perceptions and to the ongoing specific mission of religion in the history of Western spirituality. We know and insist upon the oneness of matter and spirit. Sometimes we're convinced of the utter folly of such a position with its inherent optimism, and yet we don't seem to be able to let it go. Sometimes all of religious history seems to us one vast plot by which the nations of the world hope to convert us to their otherworldliness, making it painfully obvious that salvation is not to be found in this life, that the true realm of the spirit must be elsewhere. No avail. We dig in and we hold on to the earth. Our running back and forth is not to be seen only as a ladder in moments of stress. The picture is turned on its side when we are seen scurrying back and forth across the tightrope that's stretched between matter and spirit, desperately patching things up at one end or the other, even when the link appears to be so terribly tenuous. We dare not pronounce it as broken. The transformation of the ebb into a moment of religious legitimacy may take countless forms. The via activa, as one side of the spiritual life, recognizing itself as not more and not less than that entity, may then rightly seek its fulfillment through social concern, political involvement, the kinds of political stances that would emerge as expressions of the spiritual, as we see it, can of course not be specifically predetermined, but would have a good deal to do both within the maximizing of human freedom and the pursuit of peace. For others, the active life could involve teaching, involvement in the personal and religious growth of others, the special concern that we develop for student comrades. And still others might find their fulfillment in the redemptive robustness of physical labor, particularly such as would involve them with the realms of plant and animal. Through all of this, the maintaining of religious perspective will be essential. And I dare say will be an uphill struggle. If this presence that I speak of is to be rediscovered in the weekday world, in our everyday lives, demands will be made upon us that will radically reorient the direction of our lives. Demands of discipline of lifestyle, of ritual patterns, of interpersonal openness, which hardly thrive in the context of the mechanized, isolated, and frightened lives of those in society. The work of redemption, no matter what form it takes, will require new and intimate communities of support which live outside the current standards of achievement and success. We might do well to look at the vow of poverty that's found in monastic life, though seeking to read them somewhat more broadly than has been done in the past. Such a religious path, if not watered down to absurdity, will speak only to very few. And in some ways, I think that's for good. Ours is not an age in which popular spiritual movements are able to escape terrible perversion. Just as there are moments of ebb and flow in the individual spiritual life, there at times appears to be historical periods of ebb and flow in humanity's general awareness of the Spirit. If we are to survive this great age of spiritual ebb, it will only be by the creation of small but significant spiritual individuals who can plant the seeds for what may be for some future generation, which may grow and be harvested by some future generation. But even for the few, I think the task remains formidable. Our membership cards in the Western intellectual community are parted with the greatest of difficulty. We cannot proclaim ourselves to be traditional believers. It is hope that we're too honest, even to try to talk ourselves into that position. The fragmentation of truth is part of our legacy as 21st century people. Yet maintaining our roots in the current intellectual milieu while trying to overcome cynicism and detachment is so much more easier said than done. I would call for nothing less than a re-mytholization of our lives, while not abandoning our outsiders' knowledge of the role of myth and the way it functions. We must be able to take the leap of re-entering the world of myth, in which the constant confrontation with sacred presence is of the very fabric of daily existence. Our running back and forth, our dancing at two weddings, our standing in two worlds can become rhythmic rather than a fragmenting process, only as we begin to take ourselves seriously as human beings of great spiritual potential and great spiritual strength. Our weakness of soul is less real than we would sometimes like to believe. Such seriousness and renewed confrontation with our inner strength can come to us when we rediscover who we are, as we claim our place as members, albeit in our own way, of some eternal faith community. We've usually fled because that task is too great. The burden, too much to bear. When we heard a voice say, "A kingdom of priests," even before the theophany itself, we somehow knew it was time to run away. Again, in the symbolic presence of Jonah, when we saw that it meant transforming the world, what did we do? We turned and fled. Who? Us. The world? Madness. And so we continue to live our lives, or at least of that nefarious bargain. And who is to say that transforming the self is any less a challenge than transforming the world? Faith is eternal. Its demand is infinite. And we want to reject both madness and flight. In learning to live with the rhythm of our inner tides, there may be a path that brings some peace. Not the stillness of the lake or the quietness of the pond. Those we strugglers may never attain, and thus we reject them. Rather, I'd like to leave you with one thought. Rather, I'd like to leave you with the thought of the peace of the waters of ocean, ever churning, smashing, rising, falling, finding their peace in the regular breathing of the tides, seeing themselves and their beauty both in the ebb and in the flow. An end to flight. Who is the person who can stand to live with his or her own holiness? Perhaps the Messiah. Maybe that's what the Messiah is all about. Thank you. It doesn't really have to be questions, comments, ideas, opinions. Yes, sir.
I don't know how quite to put this in words, but you were talking about transforming the world and also transforming the self. It seems to me that so-called religious people are more into transforming themselves, obeying rules, obeying commandments, their characteristic, while like secular humanists are more interested in social action type of things, improving the world. And it seems to think you need to do both, and I wonder if you could sort of comment on that.
Well, I think one of the one aspect to religious life is to follow rules. I mean, that's why I like to make a distinction oftentimes between religion or what's religious and what's spiritual. Because when you talk about religion or religious, you're talking about a set of criteria, dogma, ritual, a way of life that needs to operate a certain way based on certain principles or ideals. When you talk about spirituality, you're solely talking about relationship between human and divine, or human and God, or human and higher power, whatever you wish to call it. So I think what I'm talking about, I was trying to refer more to the spiritual rather than to the religious notion, because I think you can get caught up in rules and regulations and dogma and being considered an outsider if you don't follow it in a very particularistic manner. From the tradition that I come from the Jewish tradition, one of the things that we say is that if you save a single life, it's as if you've saved the entire world. And if you destroy a single life, it's as if you've destroyed the entire world. And I think, the idea behind that is that transformation comes from the person outward to the world, that it's the person who can make a difference in the world. And the hope is that we will make enough of a difference in the world to transform things. Outside of religious rules, outside of religious boundaries. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Kind of piggybacking onto that a little bit, you had talked about the ebb and flow of religion or spirituality. And you kind of referred to, and correct me if I'm wrong, that right now we seem to be in a bit of an ebb as the 21st century man. Would that be something that we need to either push forward or struggle out of to regain the flow? And in that case, are the pressures that I know I feel, and probably the younger people in this, of the technology and the speed at which life is coming at us, is that something that is going to be even more of a struggle to reach spirituality versus the slower paced life of the 1950s, or even beyond that, or before that?
I think it seems, again, this is just my opinion, it seems to me that every century or every generation is fraught with its own difficulties. It's fraught with its own problems, its own roadblocks, its own detours. And I think in every generation, you have to try and find a way to push through those roadblocks or go around those roadblocks and continue to forge a path towards the spirit, or the hope is towards the spiritual.
So it's not really a linear path.
I don't think it's linear. I think you have to take what you have. I mean, I think you have to see what you've got in front of you, to see what the landscape is in front of you. I mean, if you're dealing with technology, then you have to find ways through the technology. I mean, I run a spirituality group, and we're forever talking about, the quickness of things nowadays in terms of, if you think about it, we take express trains, we drink instant coffee, we eat fast food. I mean, everything leads to speed. I mean, if something doesn't come on the screen of my computer within a millisecond, I'm annoyed. So I'm part of the problem, and I think we have to learn ways of dealing with the situations that we have while still being able to embrace the spiritual, or still allowing the spiritual to allow us to flow.
As you had said that spirituality wasn't necessarily aided by reason.
Right.
But we are in a very reason-driven society right now, so it's almost that we just need to step back and recognize this is reason and spirituality, and need to.
And I think, and that's what I was referring to when I started, when I said you can't, tanza balakasa, you can't dance at everybody's wedding. And that you have to kind of step back and say, well, I'm going to go to this one or I'm going to go to this one. But I can't go to both. I can't live with my feet in two worlds. It's very difficult to do that because ultimately those worlds don't necessarily merge. They go further apart and you split apart like a wishbone. Yes?
I've heard the word tetragrammaton a couple different contexts, and I think it's like rooted in
the tetragrammaton in Hebrew are the letters Yud He Vav He, okay, which are pronounced in Hebrew Adonai, which means God. Those in secular literature, when they pronounce Yud He Vav He, it's either Yahweh, okay, you've seen it as Yahweh, or you've seen it as called the Tetragrammaton. The Tetragrammaton is an abbreviation for a 32-letter name for God. Okay? That 32-letter name for God has been lost. Okay? If you go back to the Old Testament, I don't know how much you want to get into this. If you go back to the Old Testament, God's name, full name, was only pronounced once a year by one person. It was pronounced once a year by the high priest. And he would only pronounce it on the holiday of Yom Kippur when he entered into the tabernacle. Okay, it would only go in once a year. And that name was pronounced, and that name was known. When the priesthood was abolished, or when the priesthood was dismantled, the name was lost. And the only thing that we were left with were the Yud He Vav He, the abbreviation for that much longer name. That's what it's talking about in terms of tetragrammaton.
It kind of sounds like a mantra a little bit, like a Buddhist mantra.
There are those mystics, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who use Adonai or Yahweh as a mantra from time to time doing meditation. Sure, it can be used. You can try it. Other questions? Yes?
I wasn't here for the lecture.
Excuse me?
I wasn't here for the lecture,
Oh.
but just listening to the questions. I guess you would mention something about an ebb and flow of spirituality throughout generations.
Mm-hmm.
It strikes me that maybe we become less spiritual, but certainly the religious drives are just as strong as they've ever been. Do you think maybe then that there's not so much an ebb and flow, but it's always present? And there needs to be a cognizance that everything is part of the same whole, and you can't really change, what part of society someone fits into that, is keeping it all moving forward. It's probably important.
I think that in order to continue ebb and flow, I think that it's very difficult to do it just religiously. Okay, because as someone mentioned, religion is a lot more about dogma and rules than it is being endowed with spirit or being connected with God's presence or the like. So I think that what I was trying to say is that if you use the Sabbath as sort of an ideal, where that's a day of relationship with God, it's difficult to make the Sabbath every single day because it doesn't necessarily relate to our lives every single moment. But I think that we move back and forth between those two worlds through ebb and flow or with ebb and flow. And I think it seems to me that if we were more concerned with relationship than we were concerned with rules and dogma, God's presence or a higher power's presence or spirituality's presence would be much stronger and I think more long-lasting throughout the week. Okay, but we're so connected with rules and regulations and things like sin and things. I mean, and I didn't mention this in my talk, but we're also very connected with reward and salvation and punishment, rather than being concerned with our lives now, here and now, where our lives here and now are almost, I mean, some people think of it as this is just a temporary holding cell, you know, for the next world. So why should we pay any attention to what's now when what is important is in the next world? I'm not sure that's the way to look at a relationship spiritually. I think that it's important to try to find a connection between man and spirit, or humanity and spirit, in the here and now, and maybe not worry so much about the future, whatever the future holds. I don't know if that answers it. Yes?
I don't know if this ties in or not, but you mentioned or I don't think proposed the possibility of introducing mythology as an option, or bringing that into one's life. How does that work?
Well, I think so much of religion is mythological. I mean, there's so many aspects of religion, it doesn't matter what religion you're talking about, that there's myth. And I think if we were to bring more of that back, it may give us, even if it doesn't give us a greater understanding, I think it would give us a connection with the past that we don't seem to have now, that we've seemed to lost. Or maybe we can update the mythology to make it work for the 21st century, you know, so that we get a sense of connection with the ebb and flow. I mean, there's always going to be up and down. There's always going to be ebb and flow. I mean, that, you know, running in and out of having spiritual encounters. I think, though, that if we were to make spirituality / religion more meaningful in terms of modern myth, modern technology, modern action, modern sensibility, I think if we were to make it more now, it would speak to people a little bit better. Now, again, I think you're always going to have the tension of you know, having it all the time. I don't think that we are able to make that presence live with us all the time. There's a philosopher, a Jewish philosopher. His name is Martin Buber. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Martin Buber. Martin Buber speaks of two kinds of encounters. There are I-it encounters. Those are encounters that we have every single day. Encounters that we have with people, encounters that we have with things, encounters that we have with intellect. They're just commonplace, everyday relationships. And then there's I-thou relationships. And I-thou relationships are relationships that come along fleetingly, okay? But when they come along, they have this impact upon the person that keeps them going until maybe the next one. And maybe someone will only have one I-it relationship every 5 years or every 7 years. But the impact of it, the memory of it, the strength of it is such that it lasts that period of time until the next one takes place. And maybe that's the kind of thing we should be looking for in terms of spirituality. We should be trying to attempt to find the I-thou encounters whenever we can and revel in them and embrace them, rather than just the I-it encounters that take place, that are going to take place anyway on an everyday basis.
Professor, do you think that we can realistically increase the level of spirituality within society without dismantling larger social structures like modern-day capitalism that seems to defy everything that has to do with spirituality? It's, based on greed and personal achievement. And if we do have to deal with that system, what do you see replacing it in order for society to become more spiritual and thrive?
First, I think you have to have a society that wants to become more spiritual. I'm not sure that society as a whole desires that kind of spirituality. I mean, maybe they do, but I'm not sure that they do.
But I think your point that we're constantly in flux.
Yeah, I think we are
is valid, and that would signify to me that we are looking to change.
And that we're looking to change, that we're looking to change society.
Ourselves
at least at the times when there's flow, we may be thinking about changing society. I'm not sure about the ebb when we run into rather than run out of. I think there's a lot. I think that there's a lot that dissuades us. I think there's fear. I think that there is. You called it greed. I call it politics. I think politics is a huge impediment to spirituality. I think a tremendous impediment to spirituality, especially when politics are trying to infuse religion within the political landscape. I think what it does is it sets up or tries to set up artificial rules that tend to confuse people tremendously as to really what's spiritual and what's religious. I think that before you end up with a society, I mean, even a place, for example, like Rome, like the Vatican, or a place like Israel, you have tremendous gaps in spirituality. Okay, and I think at times a place like Israel, where there's an abundance of religious people, religiosity, and spirituality, different religions, Islam and Judaism and Christianity, all stem out of there. I think there are times that Israel itself refuses to make a decision whether or not it is a democracy or it's a theocracy. It tries to, it tries to dance in both worlds. And as you can see with some of the difficulties that ensues in it, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And I think until we make certain decisions for ourselves as to how we want to live, or how we want society to unfold, or how much presence we want the spirit to have within society, or spirituality to have within society, I don't think there'll be very much movement at all. But I think it would take a huge move. It would have to start with a grassroots movement that would sort of be on the fringe of society that would gain adherence slowly over time. I don't envision a spiritualized society anytime soon.
Neither do I. My question was, maybe I wasn't clear.
No.
Do you see the structures as capitalism, for example, as an impairment?
Well, I think that's just one impediment.
Certainly.
I think there's many impediments. I think expectations of people are an impediment. I think the fact that we have people work 6 and 7 days a week, that they don't take time for themselves. I mean, I think that's an impediment. Now, you might plug that into capitalism. I mean, I would plug it into sociology. But still, until we're interested in coming to terms with those kinds of things, I don't envision a huge spiritual awakening in society. I think it will happen in small pockets, small groups of people, but I don't think that it will become a nationalistic movement, not anytime soon. Not in the structure that we live in. No. Yes?
You referred to mythology. What specifically are you talking about? I can't connect with it specifically.
Well, when you talk about mythology, I'm talking about things like angelology, angel, I mean, those kinds of ideas that you find biblically, okay, that are mythological in nature. Those are the things I think that if we were to update, myths to modern sensibility or modern, it might be a way to allow people to gain some inroad into spiritual literature. I think that may be one way.
Accept that these don't exist as they're put in the Bible?
Excuse me?
What are you saying that we should take the positions that they don't exist?
I think we have to look at them for what they are, and I think they're myths. I think that there's a lot of. It doesn't matter if you're talking about the Old Testament or the New Testament. I mean, there's mythology. Just the idea of Abraham raising a knife to kill his son. Okay, I think that's a mythological story for a given reason.
So sort of like a parable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's very much a reason why the story was there. I mean, it's pretty clear that we were moving away from the offering of human beings as sacrifice, and it becomes a polemic against human sacrifice. So I mean, we know the reasons why the myths are there, but there's still. I think if we had modern myths or modern stories, modern parables, maybe you don't like the word myth, parables, maybe modern parables that speak to people today in modern terms, in terms of the society and the world in which they live or we live, I think they might be more beneficial and helpful. I mean, it's a radical change. What I'm referring to is a radical change for religion/spirituality. Okay? Remember, though, I'm not solely from a theological point of view. I'm also trying to come from a philosophic point of view, from an intellectual point of view. Yes?
First of all, I very much enjoyed the lecture. But I think you might be taking sort of an idealized view of the spiritual awakening. Just because in a perfect world, I feel like that would lead to prosperity for the individual and for the society. But in the real world, you could call instances of a social spiritual awakening, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think that's what happens in the real world when the spiritual awakening, occurs. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I think that as human beings, we're sort of conditioned, or it's inherent in our nature to view ourselves perpetually in a time of flow. I'm not, since the idea of an apocalypse, a large percentage of the population has always thought that the apocalypse would occur before they were to die. I just feel that that's a condition of humanity, and I'm wondering if you could pinpoint a time that if you had lived during this time or in this place, that you would have felt it was a time of flow. That it was a time of spiritual flow.
That it was a time of spiritual flow?
Yes.
Medieval Spain. Some parts of it. Jewish Jews and Muslims and Christians.
Medieval Spain. I was actually going to say when the Babylonian exile occurred. I thought that was a time of great spirituality. And the reason I say that is because some of the most prolific academies in the world grew up in Babylonia, out of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, after the destruction of the temple, when the people were literally carried off to Babylonia, and when they had the opportunity to come back, they wouldn't come back. They were so spiritually being nourished and nurtured in Babylonia, they didn't want to come back. And there was a rivalry that was set up actually between the Jerusalem academies and the Babylonian academies. So I would say that would be one period of time that was, out of upheaval, came a tremendous amount of spirituality. Yes?
I'm an historian, so I can just put my credentials on the table. I can think of two examples from American history. There's the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. Times of tremendous spiritual movement in this country. The first was the 17th, 40s, and 50s, essentially. The second was pretty much the first half of the 19th century. You could look those up. There certainly are times, it seems, where people are moved by the presence or moved towards the presence more than other times. There may be a relative sort of comparison.
Right. I think it's an apt comparison. I mean, because out of struggle, comes this great spiritual identity and this great spiritual nourishment, and it was prolific. It wasn't just small. I mean, and out of that spiritual awakening grew other spiritual communities. So we know that it can happen. It just doesn't happen all that much. Yeah.
You were saying before that you kind of think of like right now we're kind of going on that downward slope of widespread spirituality. And I think technology has a large role to play for that, but I think that in that like sense of always desiring something, this isn't done, I gotta go watch my shows on in 20 minutes, or like the game, there's always something else. I think that having so much of that technology having that such a widespread effect on people, I think that also makes you come to realize just the same that because of that widespread distraction, you can realize how peaceful the present moment really is. So I think that like the more technology we get, the more spiritual one could possibly be in that same situation.
Could be.
Exactly.
Could be.
In response to that, exactly. So it's kind of like, as far as someone goes right, someone's always going to go that same distance left. So it's, even though we're going down, I think we're, I think spirituality as a whole is coming, people are kind of dropping religion and picking up religiousness. They're dropping the idea of being Christian and picking up the idea of being Christ. Not necessarily following what, some crazy dude up in a castle doing in Rome or whatever, but really seeing the present moment right here and learning to love each other and thinking like, wow, Christ, God is love. Like, okay, I get that now.
I have just a short story. When you mention technology, it just occurred to me that this afternoon, someone said to me, Rabbi, you can put the Book of Psalms in Hebrew on your iPhone for free. So I thought, wow, that's really great. So I go to the App Store and I find the Book of Psalms and it's downloading to my phone. And I was thinking, the thing that crossed my mind is, I wonder how many people are doing the same thing and how many people are downloading Angry Birds. Who's going to win this afternoon? Psalms or Angry Bird? I didn't come up with an answer. But
who's going to be happier when their phone runs out of battery?
Sure. I mean, I'll have the Hebrew of Psalms then. Other questions? Thoughts, ideas? Doesn't have to be a question, just...
I wonder how much you sort of talk about we're in an ebb as far as religious, but we're in the secular Northeast. What if we were living in the Bible Belt? Would we think there was an ebb, or we think there was a flow?
Do I think it would be a flow in the Bible Belt?
Yeah, if we all lived there. Will we be talking this
I
way?
don't, nope, I think we'd be, nope, I don't think it would be any different. Not at all. Not at all. I think, again, I think that people often make the mistake of using religion and spirituality synonymously. And I think from where I stand, that's a mistake. I think it's a grave mistake to say that religion and spirituality. I mean, I know people who want no connection to religion and religious rules and religious dogma, who are extremely spiritual people. I mean, extremely spiritual people. So I wouldn't, just because it's the Bible Belt, doesn't make them ebb and flow any better than we do up
So
here.
you're just talking about spiritual ebb and flow,
Mhm.
not religious.
Right, spiritual ebb and flow. Mhm. What? Oh, my wife is telling me that if you want to read about myth, you should look at The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell, which is probably the paradigm work on myth.
Just to go with that before I make the point, I'd say the hero with 1,000 faces.
It's the other one on my list.
Okay.
But you made a point about updating the parables. I'm kind of curious what you think about modern authors being those parable writers. As you know, I mean, it might not be canon or something, but someone like James Baldwin or Franz Kafka.
You know, just because something's not biblical doesn't make it not worthwhile. Just because it doesn't have the force of history to it doesn't make it not meaningful. So I think you know, modern authors can do as well with parables as biblical authors.
So I guess then maybe my point is, isn't it already happening?
Is it what?
Isn't it already happening then?
Sure,
We're always creating.
yeah, I think it's just the number of people that they touch are few and far between.
What about like the alchemist? That's all 50 million copies worth. That's huge. That's like a very spiritual event.
Okay. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, what is 50 million people compared to like 300, you know, very big, right?
I think that, I mean, I think that if we could get more people turned on to parable, more modern parable, and you can start things like book discussion groups or and have there be a conscious, active, ongoing dialogue about some of these things that can really grow, that would be great.
And I look at, I feel the same way, and that's where I look for, and I read a lot about music too, really speaks to me. And you know, Bob Marley, I think he unified the world, the modern world more than anyone has, you know, like Gandhi for him, but you know, through music, and I think that got really people talking too, because you might listen to music and find yourself reciting the words, but not really understanding what they mean, and then one day coming to that realization. And
I never mentioned music. I mean, I think music can be inspirational as well. I agree with you. And it doesn't even have to be music with words. It doesn't have to be lyrics. It can just be music that can be very spiritual and very spiritually moving. But you have to get enough people to buy into that hopefully it would make an impact, a difference.
You know, let's go.
We can start a book club at Tunxis, you know, and play music in the background.
Let's start a band.
Well, I don't know if I start a band, but the last time I played the piano was when I was in the 4th grade. Yes.
And what are these ideas and these desires to better oneself and better the others turn out to be false? I mean, French revolutionaries, great ideas, but you know, a lot of people lost their heads. How do you, where that caution, how do you limit yourself or others not to stray, you know, a force.
Well, you know, I am not one who acknowledges perfection very easily. In other words, I don't think that there's any perfect path to spirituality. I don't think there's any perfect path to the divine. I mean, I think that paths to the divine or paths to the spirit are fraught with all kinds of casualties. And I think you learn from the casualties. I think you grow from the casualties. I mean, I don't think that the casualties that ensue along the road are necessarily bad. I just think that especially if you're able to take something from them and grow and help a movement click or help a movement build itself. So I don't think that the wrong or right necessarily is all that important as much as trying different things to see which thing. I mean, you're never going to know until you try things. You're never going to know what's going to work until you try it.
So potential body count would not dissuade you?
Potential body count. Well, I still believe in, if you save a single life, it's like you saved the whole world. That if you save one person, then that's doing something.
But quite often the opposite is true. I mean, the desire to enlighten local residents here by pilgrims cost, some say, millions of lives.
Mm-hmm.
Is it millions of worlds destroyed?
I don't think it has to be done violently. I think it can be done non-violently.
But quite often, I mean,
we've learned from the past, or hopefully.
I don't know if we did, because we keep introducing our values through the, barrel of a gun. And we just call it collateral damage nowadays, and we apologize.
But I don't know if that's spiritual.
But we believe that those are core values that we're introducing, just like pilgrims believe they were introducing true God to these, unwashed savages. Now we're doing it all over the world. We just call it democracy, but we think, this is the way. That's how you grow as a spiritual human being also, as an individual. I just wonder, it's like that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It seems to prove itself over and over again with every generation.
But just because something's taken place in the past, what's that commercial? Just the past performance is not necessarily indicative of anything in the future, a future growth. Just because it happened that way in the past, if you're working with different people with a different mindset, a different ideology, with a different theology, maybe the outcome will be different. I mean, I don't think you can do this without faith and without hope. I mean, I think you need both qualities to allow spirituality to grow. Without that, I think that you might be barking up the wrong tree. I think you need faith and hope to make it happen. Yes?
I was just going to say in answer to you, that in most of your comments, you seem to be extending to the societal level rather than the individual level. And perhaps if you think about this in terms of the way Rabbi Herman was speaking of the individual struggle and not just extrapolate to societal. I'm not saying that that's a panacea, but but you tend to be viewing it through that lens.
Well,
if you're not paying as much attention to the individual level.
No, my point is it starts with individual. I mean, it starts through individual. Somebody has an influence on you, you get ideas, you organize a group, start discussing them, and all of a sudden it's out of your hands. And that's how, most movements operate. I don't know, that's how Nazism started. In a way, Hitler got certain ideas from certain writers and he just kind of condensed them in his head, and all of a sudden we have a Holocaust.
And that's also how Gandhi started his flow, so it's kind of like, Hitler intended on on almost that endgame where Gandhi depended on like, all right, I'm going to be so peaceful, such a solid rock.
No, I understand, but how many Hitlers do we want to suffer to have one Gandhi once in a while?
That's unavoidable. That's part of the human condition, it seems to me. You know, men are not angels, men must strive to be angels. We're not angels, it's as simple as that. Even the best of us.
It might be way off base here, but a lot of the ideas you're expressing kind of remind me of the collective unconscious. There is a strong I'm curious if Carl Jung had any comments on your thoughts.
I've read Jung. I mean, he's probably sitting in my subconscious, so sure, probably did. Other questions? Yes?
Just had a comment related to the question raised by a gentleman over there that quoted how it's paid by the intentions. I think we have the question of nuance. Our previous president, I'm going to divulge, it doesn't divulge in politics, but the previous president said, I don't do nuance. Our current president might be guilty of doing too much nuance, but you know, I'm going to paraphrase this, but there's a passage in the Zohar, the seminal text of the Kabbalah, which reads, he for whom the Torah is only understood literally, that one might just as well never have been born. And then at the other end of the dynamic, you have what I call mystical fundamentalism, which is a specific spiritual group that earmarks its particular path or approach as the way to go, as the only way. You know? That kind of risk of making the spiritual something that is hardened to a too much nuance, possibly, so that we can't necessarily recognize the brethren and those in our midst who have valid spiritual paths. So I think we're always sort of working with that question of nuance and how when to be nuanced, when to embrace something grander or something more general. We have that kind of really that flow between those two goals.
Thank you.
Just wondering, might you also be talking about sort of a hardening of belief systems and out of that, well, one of the things that I see that, you know, that makes me uneasy in the world today is a loss of tolerance.
Loss of tolerance?
Yes. There seems to be less of that in the air than there used to be. And
I think you're right.
Sort of enlarging our sphere of accepting, you know, other belief systems without feeling they invalidate our own. Might go a long way towards the kind of living in flow more than living in flow.
I think we tend not to be as tolerant of other beliefs, other ideas, except maybe when you come to a university, when you come to a college, where you know the forum is completely open. But out in the marketplace, it's very different.
Well, but when you sort of talked earlier, you said that how deleterious you think politics can be to the process. It seems to me if there's one arena where tolerance is certainly headed, I would say it's in the arena of politics. It's just, and then to go along with that, I think there's been a tremendous loss of civility in the conversation, in the raw conversation. I think that's something we need to sort of.
I recently went to a talk at the Connecticut Forum, and the whole theme of the Connecticut Forum that particular night was the loss of civility, and it was fascinating, you know, to hear some of these speakers talk. You know,
I think it's one thing to mourn the loss, and I think many people agree that it's less than it was. The question is sort of what will it take to re-inject it into the larger dialogue? And can we, or is it something that, as you said, we have to sort of do person by person, individual by individual?
I don't think we can force feed it to anybody. I think it has to flow from the individual to individual. I think that's how you build it. Otherwise, I think all you're gonna face is rejectionism, which is what we're doing now. We're just rejecting it.
One more question, maybe?
Anybody else?
Where's God?
What is God, or where is God?
See, I would.
I guess maybe just to clear up your distinction between, again, it's a different lectures than we did, but the distinction between religion and spirituality. Would you maybe characterize it as the difference someone like Emmanuel Levinas draws between, how we typically think of the ethical situation and how we deal with other people, and the way he says, we should approach other people, where the responsibility is to the other person rather than to making sure they meet our demands.
I guess the way I try to separate religion and spirituality, or the way I have it separated in my mind, is that religion is based on a set of fundamental principles that come down from the past, that are accepted and honed and are the basic foundation for that particular religion. Spirituality, on the other hand, is self-generated. It doesn't come out of an established tradition. Although you can find spirituality in religion, I'm not sure that that's always the goal of religion, to find spirituality. I think the goal of spirituality is to develop communion, to develop relationship, to develop connection. I think that's the goal of spirituality. And that's the only goal of spirituality. And I think that oftentimes what ruins the connection are the rules, okay, is the dogma, is the dialectic that comes out of that it can only be this time, only be this place, only happen here, when that's not who we are. I mean, it's what we've become, and it's what we're herded into being, but I don't know that that's who we are as human beings.
My way or the highway?
Excuse me?
My way or the highway?
My way or the highway, exactly. And I think that's the main difference between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is all about connectedness, not rules. Okay? I mean, I've heard ministers, rabbis say that you can't do this, you can't, and it has nothing to do with morality. It has everything to do with rules. It has everything to do with rules that may have made sense in the past. Maybe they made sense in the past, but they don't necessarily make sense today. And now, you can argue with me and say, well, there's a tradition, and tradition says this, and that's fine, but we don't necessarily live in the world of tradition. We live in the world that we live in. That's the way. I mean, I think it's important to meet people where they are, not where you think they ought to be.
Or where they were.
Or what?
Or where they were.
Or where they might have been. And maybe, I wasn't there. Maybe they weren't there then. I don't know. I'm not sure. But I don't think that you try to force feed ideas from the past that make no sense. I don't care what religion you're talking about. It could be any religion, any Western religion. It impedes a sense of the Spirit. It impedes that connection that I was trying to get across, before. And I'm the first one to admit, I'm a radical when it comes to being a rabbi. I'm not your mainstream, everyday rabbi. I always have stood apart. I like the position of standing apart. It generates conversation. It generates ideas. So I'm not, if you had another rabbi here, they might give you a completely different idea. of spirituality. But I tried to approach the topic from the point of view of philosophy of religion rather than religion itself or the theology of religion.
We thank you for that.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.